Okay, it is 2 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to let us begin and folks can still obviously trickle in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon, evening, Saturday morning, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Erin Aoyama. I'm part of the Tadaima Steering Committee, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this really fantastic session, which is called The Politics of Translating Incarceration Literature. So with that very brief introduction, I'm going to pass it off to the panelists and to Lisa to really get us going. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thanks everyone for joining. So this is a panel about the politics of translating incarceration literature. So just want to stress the political part, that translation is never a neutral act, but a political one. I wanted to just start by also acknowledging that, thinking about this experience of Japanese incarceration, there's also another population of people right now that have been incarcerated and entrapped in an open-air prison camp for 2 million people since 1948, and they are currently undergoing a genocide. And so everything that we say tonight, I think, has to be said within that context and that acknowledgement. So I'd like to start by just kicking it off to the panelists. The aim of tonight is to talk specifically about TESSAKU, which is a literary journal that was produced at Tule Lake. Junko and Frank and Andrew have all variously been involved with translating this Japanese language literary journal that was produced by Japanese Americans who were incarcerated there during World War II. And so I guess I thought I would start with Junko and asking her to speak a little bit about her first encounter with these materials. I think, Junko, you first encountered these materials at the University of Iowa. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about what drew you to this material, to translating it, and just to learning more about it.
Okay. Well, my first encounter, that was right after I finished my coursework for my doctoral dissertation for history. And I think, my advisor's advice at the time was that in order to write a dissertation, you need to have a significant amount of primary sources to write a dissertation. And so I just kind of looked, and then at that point, I knew that I want to write some topics on Japanese American history. But since I'm native Japanese, so I wanted to use a Japanese language, sources. Then in that way, I found the whole array of papers in UCLA has a lot of collections of papers from those, like, I think the three peoples who involved in literary movement from pre-war to post-war. So I think, and then with that, then also the Japanese scholars have, recently republished entire literary journals done by Japanese Americans, including TESSAKU. Then I think that's a kind of goal sign for, like, it's a significant amount of the sources that to write a dissertation. And so that's where I delved into, then started to reading literary journals and such.
Okay. So were you kind of interested in this topic, and then you happened to find Japanese language sources related to it?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you were translating this material, well, I guess I would ask, when was it that you first encountered this material, and what were, I guess, some things you were thinking about as you were first translating this? What kind of difficulties or challenges did you encounter? What was going through your head?
I would say, like, I encountered this, I think I would say, like, 1999, 2000. And then I think that one of the things is there's a TESSAKU, it's the incarceration literature. So there is, so there is a kind of censorship, not a wholehearted censorship, but nevertheless, it's a censorship. And then there is a lot of element of self-censoring. That there was a kind of one of the editorial comment that they did a competition for literary works within TESSAKU for the new year. And then one of the prize that they earned, the first prize novel, the story that they got, they were in the editorial note that you know, we can't publish this material due to the political natures of this novel. So there is a great amount of self-censorship so that it doesn't become trouble in the eyes of administration. Yeah. So I think my thing is that the reading literature, but knowing that this is not written in a free environment, that they do a lot of self-censoring. And so how do I understand this in that context? And then I think it need to be a nuanced understanding of what's said and what's not said. And nevertheless, I think that they really captured a lot of sentiment, feeling, and sometimes the kind of cultural pride to Japanese language and Japanese culture that I think if it's not a literature, it was not possible to capture. And then I think literary journal provided a way not only for the writers to write about it, but also for the audience, for the readers who purchase those journals through the camp canteen. I mean, there's just a kind of sense of community created. And then I think that it's not just only in Tule Lake that the literature was sold and sent to different camps or different people in Japan or sometimes Manchuria. And so I think that I just wanted to, if I write something about it, that you know, about this literature, I also wanted to kind of capture this sense of communities that the literature created.
Can you say a little more about the sending some of the copies to Manchuria? I don't think I was familiar with that. So it means that the journal was it was being read by people outside of the camps and even maybe outside of the United States, right?
I think it was something like a kind of like letters that they sent to the TESSAKU, and then they were saying that TESSAKU became so international these days that somebody in Manchuria was also reading it. So there is it's a testament to say that literary network of Japanese language was so like big that I think it didn't just happen in Tule Lake. It's a whole history pre-war that there is a abundance of, you know, the connections of writers and editors of and then there's in the Shukaku is one of the journals that published in the West Coast. And then there's the editors are kind of turned in like, you know, this volume is done by San Francisco, this volume is done by Seattle. And then that kind of writers kind of communicated. And then so that the writers know each other, even if they didn't met, that they knew from the name in those kind of, you know, journals. And so so once the camp happens, and then people move a lot, that they still maintain that connections. And then somebody might have gone, I mean, we know that there are some Japanese Americans presence in Manchuria or Korea in the, you know, and so that there was this kind of flow of literary journals that circulated around worldwide.
Yeah. So their imagined kind of reading audience for this journal was quite a lot wider maybe than we would assume. Yeah, that's really great. I guess sort of coming from a Japan perspective, what in your experience, like, did you feel that Japanese American kind of incarceration experience is well known in Japan? Is it talked about? How is it understood? I guess, yeah, if you could say a little bit more about that.
I think I wouldn't say it's well known. I mean, some people do know, but I think that like even for school setting, I mean, I don't know it is a kind of like a set curriculum to teach about Japanese American incarceration. And so that even I teach at college, I mean, who major in English language, that not many students doesn't know. And then it's probably the first encounter to the Japanese American experience was in college level. that they just there, and then this is the people who are majoring in English language, and so that they're more interested in going to studying abroad in the US or in any English speaking countries, and so that there's a lot more courses offered in terms of American history, American literatures, and that. And then but I wouldn't say that there is well known.
So it's still kind of understood as sort of American history, kind of that way. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. In terms of the sort of when you're kind of noticing that there is censorship going on or self-censorship going on, how did you, I guess, think about that as a translator? Like, how did you think about how to maybe indicate that to the reader, or to notate that in your translation somehow, or to notice the silences? I'm curious about, how you translate these sort of silences, the things that maybe aren't directly on the page.
Oh, that's a challenge, right? The only thing that I think that some of the things is that, one of the things is that, there is this, perhaps one of those editorial comment, that's editorial comment section, which is not the literary work, but editorial comment section is where, like I mentioned earlier, that they actually talk about, like, this is a prize-winning story, but we can't publish it. So these are the kind of point that the editorial comment part, like, sometimes if you're looking into literary, works, you skip that part. But I think that part, that translating that part might just kind of, give the audience the kind of context where what are the things is that they talked about. And another thing is that there are some writers who write pieces after the incarceration is over. So like in the 1950s, 1960s, and there are some essays written, and then the Japanese language literary movement really flourished in the late 70s and 80s in Los Angeles-based journals. And then I think that's where they actually write an essay on reflecting on what the experience was. And then in there, they can kind of talk about, that there are some sort of FBI investigation on us because, they wrote a piece titled The Shortwave Radio. That was a piece of the column, but then because FBI was just interested in what are these people doing with the shortwave radio, so that they kind of investigated 3 editors and that kind of stuff, and so then they got nervous, and then there are some kind of stories like that, and so then maybe talk about that in alongside the TESSAKU literature that kind of provide the readers what the context that this was published. Yeah,
that's so great. Yeah, and just sort of speaks to the translator's role in helping to bring that context and that awareness to the reader who may not have it. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, I guess, do Frank and Andrew, do you have any sort of immediate thoughts or comments on anything Junko said? If not, I can kind of go on to the next set of questions, but just wanted to.
Well, Lisa, I think we should explain for the listeners what TESSAKU was. TESSAKU was a 9-issue literary magazine published at the Tule Lake Segregation Center that we're now learning was, as Andrew pointed out, and as you translated, a high-quality literary magazine that was peer-reviewed. Didn't just accept any submissions. It was peer-reviewed by the 3 editors. And in terms of the censorship that Junko was talking about, Bunichi Kagawa was an established Issei poet, and he was kind of the mentor for the 3 editors of the magazine. But he decided not to edit the magazine because he was Issei and was not a citizen. So he bowed to Joji Nozawa of Los Angeles, Kazuo Kawai of LA, and Masao Yamashiro, who were Kibe. Because they were citizens, they felt they could better front to the authorities in Tule Lake. But it was established, as we've learned from Naval Intelligence Report, that it was founded in a direct response to the turmoil at Tule Lake from November 4th. The labor strikes, and the martial law that was declared over the disturbance. and the establishment of the stockade, that TESSAKU could be translated as both iron fence or as iron stockade, as Andrew has suggested. So it was established in direct response to the creation of the stockade, according to naval intelligence, their interviews with the three editors. So, I mean, all this shows us what the importance of what's been languishing, unknown to us, and untranslated in the pages of TESSAKU. Junko has done a remarkable job with her doctoral thesis, which you can find online if you search the term "bitter sweet home," Junko Kobayashi. You'll find her thesis, and it was her thesis that led me to her translation of a Geta by Michi Kagawa. And you're going to ask me about my anthology. Floyd Chung and I are editing this new anthology, due May 14th from Penguin, The Literature of Japanese American Incarceration. And I talked to Junko about this at the Tule Lake pilgrimage in 2018, and Junko mentioned her thesis. And in her thesis, Junko points to two short stories in particular by Georgie Nozawa and Fujio Tanisaki that she summarized but hadn't translated. So Floyd and I actually commissioned Andrew Leong of UC Berkeley to translate these short stories, and those will appear in this publication next May. But they are remarkable, and although there was censorship, through the literature, these authors convey a sense of the tension and the integrity of the Japanese American community inside a segregation center. I want to just say that Tule Lake, I think, is the final frontier for Japanese American incarceration studies. It's the least understood, most avoided, subject in our community. And finally, after 80 years, we're finally coming around to examining both the segregation center and the layers of oppression and suppression in Tule Lake, but also the literature that was produced as a result of not just incarceration, but segregation, and not just segregation, but the imprisonment in the stockade of about 200, 300 men who were the so-called troublemakers or leaders. So I think that is the significance of why we're here today talking about TESSAKU, and then Andrew will talk later about the project, his really ambitious project to translate all 9 issues of TESSAKU.
Yeah. So was it your so it was kind of your finding of Junko's thesis that prompted the idea for this anthology, or did you have had it been simmering in the back of your mind earlier than that to kind of put together an anthology of this type of writing?
Floyd Chung had a relationship with Penguin. He had translated or edited the Hanging on Union Square by H.T. Tsang. And Floyd called me up and said he had suggested doing an anthology of Japanese American literature. And did I think there was more material to be included subsequent to Lawson Inada's and Patricia Wakita's anthology from 2000 called Only What We Could Carry? And I said, you bet. And I left my bookcase behind me in focus, because you can see I've been collecting all these books for the last 40 years. I met Toshio Mori, Hisai Yamamoto, Wakako, just going out and meeting people, talking to authors, collecting their works, and collecting some protest literature from Joe Kurihara, the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, the Mother Society of Minidoka, Miroshima Bukuro's discovery on that, and Floyd's invitation provided an opportunity to kind of unleash all this material that I've been collecting, saving, and not knowing what to do with. And so that was the impetus for that.
Yeah. And how did you, from all this material, how did you kind of come together and think about editing this, or basically how was the selection process? How did you end up choosing the works that ultimately went into the collection?
Well, thank you for asking, Lisa. I mean, there are 68 pieces, which is a lot for a 300-page anthology. And we could have gone the route of doing a greatest hits collection, of doing the finest literature, the best writing, and the familiar pieces, Jeannie Houston, Julia Otsuka, And we decided to go with fiction, nonfiction, prose, and poetry, and to define literature as writing, any personal writing from the incarcerees that includes letters and essays. And so the selections here favor the what I like to say is the pointed over the poignant and the unknown over the familiar, with several new translations among the previously unseen works. And they're organized, before camp, the camps, after camp, in a way to form an epic narrative with a singular vision of America's past, and one that has disturbing resonances, of course, with American present, as you indicated earlier. But also a collective voice. I mean, if you put all these pieces together, Lisa, and you look for the voices that are trying to hold on to the integrity of the Japanese American identity and community, and the voices that are kind of pushing back against incarceration, exclusion, and censorship, not resistance per se, but just pushing back. If you put all these pieces, if you line them up, you get a kind of a shared experience, a collective voice. And that's what this volume, I think, really succeeds in doing. Is you'll be the judge, but in presenting a collective voice of a people who have been locked up. So yeah, that was the guiding principle.
Yeah, got it. Okay. And yeah, what do you imagine as the life of this anthology? Who do you hope it will reach? How do you hope it will be read? Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, classrooms and teachers. We want teachers to it's organized. No, it's very clean. So, and the introductions provide a narrative that you can look at it and figure out the whole span of the story, from the pre-war to the exclusion to post-war, and the trauma, and the attempts by Sansei and Yonsei to reconnect with the past, and of course how we're repeating our history today, sadly. And so it's all the teachers can pick out pieces to teach. But I think also what I really want this book to do, Florida and I want this book to do, is to provide a place for the uninitiated to just jump in and get the complete picture of incarceration and understand it from start to finish, and go, oh, okay, I got it. I understand now, and it's all laid out for me, start to finish.
Great. Yeah. Junko, Andrew, anything you want to ask or jump in there before I go on to the next set of questions?
So I wanted to jump in with a note of appreciation for Frank's journalistic training of the who, what, where, when, how, and why as a starting point, and wanted to reflect, Lisa, on your invitation to us to think about the politics of incarceration literature. And although we're not going deep into biography, I do think that it is important to talk about where and how we might be politically identified, and how that affects how we encounter and work with the sensitive materials in the TESSAKU collection. So just as, translation is never neutral, our starting points and our positions, our relationships to language aren't neutral either. So by way of introduction or self-introduction, so that I'm not just like an alien coming from outer space landing in TESSAKU or something like that. I'm Nisei. My mother emigrated to the United States in the late 1970s. I grew up in a bicultural household where the dominant language was English. And my mother told me one of the reasons why she didn't ever teach me Japanese or speak Japanese to me was spy ni naranai yoni, or don't become a spy, which I now understand in the context of deeper study of the World War II incarceration period in TESSAKU is really tied to some of the problems of Japanese Americans informing and spying on each other, or being asked to do so as part of the broader network of thinking about incarceration. So in terms of thinking personally about why I don't have direct ancestors who were incarcerated, survivors or descendants, it might be, and I've had strong, actually, misgivings about working from that position with survivor and descendant literature, for these reasons. It's not my experience. It's not my family's experience. I just happen to have a family background and a language background, which means that I can read things which may not be accessible to others. And so in my early work, I really, and what Frank said also resonates there, avoided working on Japanese American incarceration literature because of these concerns. I looked at 1920s literature written by so-called Issei failures, or people who didn't fit within standard, triumphant, progressive Japanese American progress, like Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei. We're all going to keep on reproducing in this ever-expanding numerical way. What happened to the Issei bachelors who were left out of that generation of progress narrative? So that's why I translated Lament in the Night. I found it particularly resonant. I would not have translated those two short stories from TESSAKU without first the example of Junko Kobayashi's dissertation, which I read as a graduate student and really inspired me to work more with Japanese language literature, and also direct invitation from Frank Abe and Floyd Chung to work with those two stories. Once that began, I realized that there's like a host of really thorny, tricky issues that can't be addressed on an ad hoc basis. So part of thinking about the process of translating TESSAKU all 9 issues is not like as a like ego trip about like, you know, here comes a scholar from Berkeley that's just going to like do it all. It's really to think from the starting point of convening a community advisory board composed of TESSAKU survivors, so Satsuki Ina, Hiroshi Shimizu, Kyoko Nancy Oda, who have all been working in different ways, including with Junko Kobayashi or other Japanese scholars, about translating materials from that incarceration camp period. And something that they really emphasized in those meetings, and an impetus for thinking about translating all 9 issues in their entirety, is that future generations or translators or editors should, as much as possible, avoid adding another layer of translation selection or an editorial intervention on what the original 4 editors did. So the approach outlined by the Community Advisory Board, which we'll execute to the best of our ability, is to try to think about each issue as a coherent unit and translate them successively 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And as part of that, and Frank can also speak to this process, not go ahead with publication or mass general publication until we've done our due diligence and good faith effort to contact, you know, some possible contributing writers and descendants of those writers.
Which is a nightmare.
Yeah.
It's really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, Andrew, I think, you know, you and I have spoken too about the way that a lot of sort of received narratives around Japanese American history have, been framed through English-speaking descendants or English language materials. And when one goes back to some of these writings by Issei or Kibe, right, writers in Japanese, we sometimes encounter moments or things that don't quite fit within the received sort of narrative, or maybe challenge the received narrative, or force us to rethink some narratives about you know, the Japanese American experience was very diverse. It wasn't singular. And so, yeah, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about that. You know, what kinds of things can come up when reading this type of literature?
Oh gosh, that's a really complicated question. I'll try to focus it through specific examples. So one of the things that comes up is that the politics or the political views of TESSAKU writers, or the characters that they invent, and so, you know, part of it is distinguishing between those two layers, often have views that are, to be blunt, shocking to me, or, you know, ultra nationalist, or openly supporting of Japanese empire or expressing sentiments that don't follow typical, maybe go for broke, 442nd, loyalty, sacrifice, narratives that are part of some versions of Japanese American incarceration history. And so thinking about how to translate those in good faith, even if the politics of the character or the narrator or the author are radically different from my own, is something that it is really tricky to think about. One example that I was working with Frank about is that there's a text, Our Father Was Taken Too, which goes into the mindset of a teenage boy who's thinking about people who identifies as Jewish pawnbrokers, buying up furniture or possessions of people that are being evacuated, in heavy quotations, sent to temporary assembly centers. And the original Japanese uses two words to express Jew. So one is a katakana Jew, and then the other is Yudayajin. And figuring out what kind of potentially anti-Semitic venom or cross-racial resentment is lingering between these two different uses, Jew and Yudayajin, and how to render that into English is and was a really messy problem.
So how did you deal with that as a translator? Did you do research into it, or what were the choices that you made?
A little bit of both. So contextually, one was in the mindset of the speaker, and then the other shifted into the narrative perspective. And so one way to handle that was to think, okay, maybe the boy is thinking Jew, but Yudayajin is more formal, third person-ish, and so might be rendered as Jewish person. And that kind of separation was something that Frank and I talked about as maybe a way to represent that. So, there's I can't remember it verbatim, but it was something like, there's nothing so horrible or grotesque as the sight of a fat Yudayajin's belly. And the choice of whether or not to translate that as the Jewish person's belly or that Jew's belly. I mean, like the range of what could be implied there, and the choice of thinking about how to translate it into English was tricky to think through.
So the process there, Lisa, was instead of saying the Jew, crassly, the loud talking Jews, I suggested trying to soften it, say loud talking Jewish people haggling for better deals. And I asked Andrew, does the translation permit that wording? And Andrew said yes. So I said, great. And the other one was, haggling for better deals. There was something gross about just seeing their, what was it, fat bellies, right?
Yeah.
And that seemed, not completely offensive. There was something worse, though. I thought it was worse than fat bellies. It was something worse, and I just found a different way to describe it. So, as the non-Japanese speaking English person, I mean, just trying to find synonyms, other words to use to make it less racial and just more, I don't know, it's still racial. I mean,
so you left it to kind of soften the racism a little bit for publication.
Yeah, we really wanted to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess going off of that a little bit more. I mean, Andrew, you've also talked about, in regards to kind of some of the issues and ideas that come up in this writing, the way that they can be sort of shocking or disrupt received or conventional ideas about what we assume or expect people incarcerated in these camps might have been thinking or writing about, when it does kind of disrupt those expectations. And the readers are perhaps, direct descendants, right, of some of these writers. It's a really tricky kind of thing to navigate. And so, yeah, I'm curious how you've thought through, is the idea of kind of contacting descendants before publication, getting their permission, is that sort of a way to kind of involve them sort of in this process? And yeah, what kind of thoughts do you have about that, I guess?
Yeah, one of the things that I think about is the kind of definition of trauma is having something happen without being able to narrativize or tell the story of what that is. And
Mm-hmm.
so the trauma of language loss across generations is that the stories are there, they're just in a form that many descendants cannot immediately encounter. I mean, so returning the story through translation could run into things like intergenerational trauma or the shock of encountering something. And on the positive side, it could also be like a moment of recovery or insight or surprise or joy. And so being the messenger for a text that could have either or more of these potential effects is really tricky and is something that I think really requires going through um, community channels
Mm-hmm.
first to the greatest extent possible. So reaching
Mm-hmm.
out through social media, doing our best to find people, friends of friends, instead of, I don't want to envision a scenario where somebody, finds out that their grandfather or grandmother published something and it being like having a particular connection to a family history that
They're
maybe,
surprised by, yeah, just
yeah,
you
they
print
don't
and they
want
go,
that
what's
story,
this?
or they haven't processed that story themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Who am I or any translator to uh, mess mess with that?
Yeah, that hadn't
Mm-hmm.
occurred to me, Andrew. We were fortunate that we were able to trace Fujiwara Tanisaki's granddaughter here in Seattle through Facebook Messenger. I
Mm-hmm.
found an obituary reference and I used Facebook Messenger to find her. And then Georgie Nozawa, we have a viewer here, Yuriko Yamaki, who I forget how we connected on this, but I did a blog post. I did a social media blog post say, does anyone know relatives of Fujiwara Tanisaki, Kazuo Kawai, Georgie Nozawa? And Yuriko replied in a DM and said, I happen to know his daughter, right, in Northern California or Southern California. And eventually I connected with the daughter and got her permission to reprint the story. We didn't need to get permissions for the legally for because the TESSAKU, Minidoka Irrigator, these were all journals and magazines printed in an American concentration camp where no one was bothering with copyrights, so nothing was copyrighted, right? And so there's that, and Andrew, in his due diligence, established that we didn't need to have worry about copyrights on TESSAKU. But Andrew makes a good point: is that you don't want to have someone pick up this book and go, "Oh my God, this is our family story." And so I was fortunate to reach. Yoriko helped me find Nozawa's daughter, but there are a number of other authors out there, and it's hard enough even to locate the author in the WRI, in the WRI records. Kazuo Kawai is still remains elusive. I don't have, any family members for him. But
Mm-hmm.
he wrote a novel that serialized over 6, 7 issues of TESSAKU
Mm-hmm.
that we excerpt. So yeah, Andrew makes a good point. We don't want to shock anyone with publication
Right.
that they're not
Yeah.
aware of.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I want to leave definitely space for questions from the community, but Junko and Frank and Andrew, maybe I just ask, is there any particular piece from this project, from TESSAKU, that you've encountered, that you've translated, that you've read, that you could maybe just share a little bit about to give the audience a bit more of a concrete sense of the examples of some of the pieces in these issues. So we talked about the range of poetry styles, right, in these issues. There are serialized novels, there's essays, there's art criticism. There's a really wide array of genres represented in here. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind maybe just briefly telling us a little bit about one in particular that sort of stuck with you to hopefully give people a taste of what's to come. Junko, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay. I think I would say like Masao Yamashiro's the I think that I forgot the title of it. I mean, he did the kind of 2 or 3 times. This is about the Modoc War. That it is about like a Tule Lake was the also the site of Modoc War against Native Americans. And I think he was doing about, there are some people who are kind of looking for like arrowhead and some of the, the claws. And then he started to thinking about like, what this place used to be. That's after the battleground of the Modoc War. And so he has this kind of, elaborate story starting from his own things about his, research in camp libraries and then trying to gather as much as information about this. And then I could talk about, he just ended up comparing the what Modoc people has gone through throughout the war with the Japanese American experience there. So that's a kind of, seeing through the kind of different oppressions, but intersecting in a same place. And that's a kind of, very brilliant piece that, I still remember.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, this author was of Okinawan descent, right? Is that right? Yeah. So it kind of also just speaks to the variety of people that were in these camps. It wasn't just Japanese Americans. There were also Okinawan Americans who may not have felt able to identify openly as Okinawan, right? Because of the layers of Japanese imperialism on top of Okinawa. And there were also various indigenous people that ended up in the camps as well, which is something we don't talk about so much. So yeah, thanks for bringing that piece up. I also read it and was really struck by it, and I'm excited to share that with people. Andrew, do you have any particular piece in mind you want to share a little bit about?
Yeah, the father of volunteers, which is showing up in the Abe and Chung edited Penguin literature of Japanese American incarceration. What really stood out to me about this story was it's a very, I think, careful retelling of the story of Job. So it goes through everything that can go wrong in a man's life. In this case, the father of 3 sons who go into the army. And it's notable that this kind of story shows up in Tule Lake, which is during the segregation period, the site where people who had answered no, no, or did not answer yes, yes, the loyalty questionnaire would have been sent. And so one of the things that stood out to me was how carefully the author redoubles on the kind of biblical parallel meter in sentence structure. And I tried to do that in the kind of scene where the family or the Sayakis are being excluded from or shunned by other residents at the Tule Lake camp before the segregation period. So, or a camp, it's actually not quite specified where it is. So the sentence is really parallel. It's like there were some kind-hearted people in the block who saw the sorrow of the Sayakis, looked on them with sympathy, and tried to comfort them. There were others who thought the Sayakis were only reaping what they had sown, so took delight in their misfortunes and cursed them. It was in this mixed atmosphere that the Sayakis left behind many difficult memories, and out of which, in sadness, they departed. And so this, like, I went to a Japanese Christian church as a child, so this is also why this kind of prose rhythm really sticks out into my head. It's like, oh, right, like we're getting into a kind of biblical moral fable about X and Y and X and Y and how. I thought that was really beautiful. And so
Mm.
I'm not going to spoil the conclusion of this devastating story, but it really gives a sense of the underlying structure.
And I missed that whole Job subtext, and so our copy editors at Penguin wanted to change the wording, right, Andrew?
Yeah.
And fortunately, I checked with you, and you said don't change it because you carefully constructed the translation.
Nice. That's
Lisa, I
amazing.
just wanted to thank you, Andrew. I wanted to your translation, Lisa, of the preface to the Fuji Shupan reprints of the TESSAKU and other camp magazines. Your translation of Shinoda Sensei's preface revealed that Bonichi Kagawa really framed TESSAKU to not be like other Issei journals, which praised natural beauty, imitated Japanese literature, or expressions of nostalgia for Japan that were prevalent in other Issei writing, and that Kagawa, according to Shinoda Sensei, really wanted to have a literature, an authentic camp literature in TESSAKU that confronts the reality of their lives in a segregation center without, a place without beautiful flowers or waterfalls. And Geta, which Junko translated, was an example of that. Wooden clogs that raise their feet above the desert sand. But and what can you make out of Geta in that context is as Junko says, something remarkable. So the preface you translated really opens up a lot of the intentions of the TESSAKU editors.
Yeah, it's a kind of
sharing
thinking
that later.
Yeah, it's a sort of thinking through what a distinctly Japanese American literature might be many decades before the articulation of such a term, right? And which didn't happen until the late 60s.
Exactly, yeah. But they, Kagawa was there, they were there, and they were trying to invent an Akibe and Issei Japanese American literature.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, Frank, do you want to talk a little bit about this piece, Geta, or any other piece that stuck with you?
That was it. No, your translation is really valuable. Is a valuable
Thank
contribution.
Yeah, did you want to speak a little bit more to this piece, Geta, and what goes on in it, just for the listeners to get a sense of what it's about, or the language?
That there is meaning in things that may at first appear to be trivial at first glance, but when you examine them closely, they have meaning. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Amazing. Okay, well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to open it up for questions to any of our panelists. If you would like, feel free to unmic yourselves and ask directly.
I have a question. Like, are you guys are going to translate more Japanese American journals like Nanka Bunge and New York Bunge? I'm so interested in those journals.
Yeah, Andrew, go for it.
Yeah,
I
do it, Andrew.
granduncle was a contributor to New York Bunge.
Wow.
He had a kind of unusual name. He was named after Tanaka Giichi, so he shows up as Tanaka Giichi, a politician in Japan. It's an odd name to have as a domestic servant in New York. But that seems like it would be a great project to pursue. I mean, right now I feel like I've got my personal hands full with TESSAKU and some Nagahara Hideaki Shoson projects, but I think your question points to an interest in and a tremendous amount of post 1945 Issei and Kibe Nisei writing that really should be distributed more. I mean, my granduncle's story in New York Bunge is this really kind of clever story about a man who can't say anything about himself, so says everything about his dog. And so it starts out with, my dog is having trouble sleeping. My dog is having trouble making it through the day. And it becomes increasingly clear that it's not really about the dog. But you know, it's a good example of what these kinds of short capsule stories can do.
In terms of further translation, I'd like to point to something that Lisa's translation pointed out, is that after the war, Joji Nozawa continued to publish his TESSAKU writers in the Rafu Shimpo in Los Angeles, and that there's a whole body of Issei writing post-war that some of which reflected back on their camp experiences. And so that I'd never heard any reference to that before, and I think that would be remarkable body of work to recover through translation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Lisa, do that, Lisa.
Well, you know,
Oh, well.
one thing that I've learned is that, you know, these kinds of projects require an enormous amount of support and organization and institutional funding. Translation is, yeah, it's difficult, it's time consuming. You know, we want to compensate people for their work, all these things. And yeah, so, you know, applying for grants and organizing, you know, enough translators who have the training, the right training in the background to be able to do this is it's no small feat. And so hats off to Andrew.
Hats off to Andrew. He's mobilizing all these resources to get just these 9 issues translated of TESSAKU.
Yeah, it's really amazing. But obviously there's so much more. And so yeah, hopefully we will, but it will definitely take time.
I think that I'll say here too. I mean, we should say 2 things, Lisa. Like, one is that we should also plug the Issei Poetry Project at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center in Los Angeles, where we're working with an archive, mostly of pre-war, but also some post-war materials by Issei poets associated with Agosto Sha, Rafu Shimpo, built around the papers of Hayashida Morio, who came to the United States in the 1920s. So we're really excited about that project, as well as a book called Doko e Yuku, or like Where to Go, a kind of modernist anthology or collection of poetry from that period. I would also say that while a lot of translation projects, particularly the multi-volume, multi-author ones, really do require teams of translators and experts to work, some projects might be things that members of the audience may just want to take on their own at first too. Like, you know, if you have Japanese language ability or bilingual to whatever degree, you know, really turn to or look at things that you're interested in, and, you know, start that way. I mean, that's kind of how I got started as a translator learner of Japanese 15, 16 years ago now, but was on that basis for starting to think about other projects.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I should also say I and a few other people were involved in a different project in 2021 around the Heart Mountain incarceration camp in Wyoming. And we translated a couple volumes of the Japanese language literary journals produced there. And some of that material is now available online. So I will link that to that later. Okay, Sho.
Hello, everyone. It's great to hear y'all talk. I'm super excited and interested about the politics of translation. And I think there's so much, you know, as someone who's 4th generation, yeah, I think thinking about there's always an act of translation in storytelling between generations. And so I think that, you know, there's a specific gulf when it's a language barrier. You know, it's like I literally can't access things in Japanese, but I also, you know, I think about my sensei father. There's an act of translation in between us that is, how do we sort of like how do I tell his story? What is his story and what is my story? And so it's really interesting to think about the way that you're thinking about, you know, these stories and how they might affect descendants. And I guess something I'm thinking through is sort of differentiating or thinking about the politics of silence, and when is silence something that should be honored and uplifted, and when is silence something that is sort of furthering oppression, basically. And so how do we, like, I find that when we tell our ancestors' stories, we're very sort of selective in we sort of gentrify our ancestor stories very sort of by nature. I think we don't want the ugly parts to continue. And I mean, I'm not sure if I really have a question, but I guess I'm just sort of posing and thinking generally, like, how do we sort of, decide what is our place to expose and what is our place to not? Because I think that if we go by consent, no one ever is going to want to expose things, right? So Japanese imperialism in our communities will never happen. Sexual violence in our communities will never get spoken on, right? Like if we go by the consent of our ancestors. And I think we have this sort of model of consent today where you ask like, oh, can we do this? And so if we ask, oh, hey, can we talk about violence in our communities? Everyone will say no, and then we'll just sort of be stuck, right? And so I'm just sort of thinking along with you and just wondering how we think about the different reasons to keep something silent, or thinking about terms of oppression and when when is it useful to soften the things that were actually quite like there was a lot of sort of the victim narrative of the incarceration it breaks down. And so I think that gap, like the Issei and hearing the connections between Manchuria, it's like imperialism was very much an active part of this moment, right? And that's something that doesn't fit within our inherited story because people are very adamant that we have nothing to do with it. And so I'm just thinking how much I can tap into my ancestral memory and know that we have relationships to imperialism, especially as someone with Okinawan ancestry, but that sort of proof often comes through things like literature, right? And so the translation becomes a very valuable act. So partly just want to say thank you, and also just thinking about these sort of difficulties and how to move forward with them.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking on that. I really appreciate that. And
it's not that difficult. I mean, if a writer writes something, they mean for it to be read. And so translating it, you want to translate it sensitively, but I mean, you can't be responsible for what the writer wrote. If the writer wrote about, sexual violence or whatever, I mean, that's that they want it to be shared. They want it to be read. So translator just translates what's on the page. Am I missing something there?
I mean, I agree with most of that. I think that Junko's dissertation has a really interesting argument about audience expectation versus Japanese and English audience. So if you were a bilingual writer and choosing to write in Japanese, you're choosing you might have been choosing your public, or choosing what Junko kind of called a semi-closed public. So the choice of translation there is some bilingual writers chose to write some things in Japanese and some in English under the expectation that people might be cautious about translating one way or the other. Like you might include like naughtier references that you didn't want your children to read, or things that you didn't want the Nisei and Sansei to quite know about. I mean, so silence works in both of those kinds of directions, as many folks might know. And so, in general, yes, if something's published and it's in the public domain, then, there are fewer qualms about doing that versus like taking somebody's secret diary and like outing them or something like that. That's personal. But, it is important also to think about contextually what might have been going on and what the expectation for audience might have been.
Yeah. And sort of going back to Junko's point about, how this experience in this literature in Japan is understood as, still an American one. I think, it's important to keep in mind that, Japanese incarceration happened, or the Japanese American experience happened in relation to lots of other people. And so to kind of remember that, that it's not this kind of closed singular sort of history, but it has relationships to other groups of people that we're also accountable to. And I think the piece by Yamashiro, about the Modoc people whose land the Tule Lake was built on really speaks to that, right? That yes, it may have been this moment that was targeting one group, Japanese Americans, but it's always in relation to other groups. And so, not to erase those external relationships, I think is really, really important. So we're at time. Do we have time for one more question, Erin? Is that okay?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so Nanako, go ahead.
Sorry for jumping in at the last minute.
No
Um,
worries.
oh my gosh. So yeah, I also have experience I'm not a professional translator, but I did translate a memoir of a Japanese woman who was in Manchuria. And so that's a different kind of expat experience from the perspective of the Japanese. But I translated it into English because my mother really identified with that story. But anyway, going back to Andrew's comment about making sure that the descendants of these writers know what's out there, that's very kind and that's a very sensitive idea, but I kind of wonder, I mean, if you ask the descendants of any writer, they're probably going to say, no, we don't want that, especially if it's a memoir.
Mhm.
And as I think somebody else pointed out, if the writer writes it, he wants it to be read, or he or she wants it to be read. So I think there are two kind of opposing pressures here. And
Mhm.
just speaking from my own experience in my own family, so I'm really interested in all these stories from my relatives who have had experience in the incarceration, in World War II, in Japan, all of these things. Some of my relatives are not very happy. And but that's kind of, I feel like, well, I have to write what I feel like needs to be told. My solution in my case was to turn it into fiction. So I'm going to try to put together this fiction novel based on, my family stories. But even just the translation of this memoir, which was written by somebody else, in Japan, my relatives, some of them were not happy. But I think that's one of the symptoms of the trauma, maybe, that's in the Japanese American community, is this reaction, almost kind of a knee-jerk reaction to anything that's not nice and clean and neat being exposed about the Japanese or Japanese relatives or Japanese Americans or anything. So that's all.
Don't tell the dirty family secrets.
Yeah, and I guess my question was, so in looking at these literary magazines, did you see evidence of, so one of the things that I think was interesting to learn in Japan when I lived in Japan was this idea of tatemae and honne. So the official story that we're going to present to everybody and the real story. And did you kind of see evidence of that in the literary magazines?
Andrew, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I have a literal illustration of a difference between the cover and the contents. So this is from a Japanese evacuation and relocation settlement copy of TESSAKU, which has pencil marking checked, nothing political or anti-American, send to Berkeley. On the top of I believe that this is, let me see, sorry, issue 7. So the in 1945. And so one aspect of this honne tatemae thing is that in order to keep the magazine running, the editors had to assert and get clearance for the magazine not being political. But of course, the contents of the stories touch on all sorts of political questions, but maybe in oblique ways that are deniable or, could be interpreted in multiple ways. So one of the prefaces has like a large segment that sings the praises of youth, or seinen, which might be innocuous, but in the context of Tule Lake, where there are oshiseinen, or young men's groups that are agitating for support of Imperial Japan, praise of seinen has particular possible meanings that might have eluded the level of, surface level censorship but for folks that are aware of what might be going on, could be helpful.
Right.
And then there are stories
People
that also,
knew, yeah. People knew what they were referring to when they said seinen dan or seinen, youth. Yeah.
A little
It was
terrifying.
code. It was a code.
Youth groups. Yeah, such a great question. Thank you for asking that, Nanako. All right, so we're 6 minutes past, so I guess I'll close it there. But so yeah, thank you very much everyone for coming, and hope you all have a great night and see you around soon. And thank you so much to the Tadaima organizers for letting us have this space tonight.